Last week, we gave you an insider's view of some of the papers and events from the 2024 Evangelical Theological Society Conference. But we still have some tea in our cup. So today, we spill the rest of the tea on this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Now, again, for those of you who don't know, the Evangelical Theological Society is the largest annual gathering of evangelical academics, apologists, and pastors. It's a place where new discoveries are announced and where people network and buy deeply discounted books. Now, we sort of left off around Thursday morning, November 21st, after sitting through the first of Peter van der Veen's papers. And this is the paper where I wasn't allowed to comment. But after that, I sat through the next Van der Veen paper. And that paper is probably what you're all really interested in, which is the Mount Ebal inscription. Does it contain the divine name Yahweh? By Peter van der Veen. Now, in this paper, Veen argued that Gershon Galil's reading of the curse amulet was wishful thinking, and offered in its place his own reading. Now, Veen still claims to read Arer Yahweh, cursed of Yahweh. The tomographic scans that he used are the exact same scans that were used in the earlier paper. They're the same sort of Rorschach test, to put it bluntly. The only difference is what we're getting now is Veen's reading instead of Galil's reading. Now, my opinion is that you might possibly maybe be able to make out a hey letter on this tomographic scan, but that's it. All the other readings are extremely dubious. Veen's reading is, in my opinion, just as much wishful thinking as Galil's. The yod, which he depends on for his reading of Yahweh, doesn't look like a yod. And his vav didn't look like a vav. And his olives were nothing but fuzzy blurs. I would have died of embarrassment to have presented this paper. It's so speculative. It was crazy. Now, on a side note, in a different paper session, Richard Hess commented on this, and he said, quote, "It still looks like a fishing weight to me," end quote. So, Van der Veen has not managed to move the needle with this paper, but still maintains that this is big evidence for a 15th century Exodus date. So he's still hoping this reads Arer Yahweh, cursed of Yahweh, and he's still hoping that his readings will sort of stylistically pan out to support a 15th century Exodus date, but in order to date that site of Mount Ebal to the 15th century. Now, ironically, right after this paper, I walked out of the session and bumped into Ralph Hawkins. And I'm a friend of Hawkins, and we decided to go out and have coffee together. Now, Hawkins is important. He wrote probably the preeminent work on the archaeology of Mount Ebal. And he told me something fascinating during coffee. That he had received the final, unpublished ceramics report from Mount Ebal. And he said that this thing was like 100 pages long. 100 pages of ceramic catalog. And he's reviewed the whole thing. But he can't publish it because the imprimatur has not given the green light for the final site report, which is still coming out. Okay? I did hear that that the final site report for Mount Ebal is still on the way. It's just waiting on certain individuals. So we can still probably expect that to be a few years coming out. But Hawkins has access to that final unpublished ceramics report. And what he told me is that there is no possibility that the Mount Ebal site could date to anything other than Late Bronze 2B, Iron Age 1. Absolutely impossible to give it any other dating. So there's a little spilled tea and a little update on the Mount Ebal site. Okay, so that covers Thursday morning. Not much happened Thursday afternoon, but at the dinner break, while IP, Mike Winger, and that ruffian man of apologists were at that dive bar with that infamous picture, the exhibitor at Educational Opportunities took my producer and me out to Juniper and Ivy, a Michelin star restaurant. Now, I have to admit, I've never been to a Michelin star restaurant, and I've never quite had a meal like this before. It was certainly an experience. I had a deconstructed mustard deviled egg, but this was not like any deviled eggs I've ever had. The whites were turned into a baked meringue, and the yolks were mixed with a sharp Dijon mustard. I then had a steak tartare mixed with oil and vinegar dressing on a piece of toast. That was followed by tuna sashimi salad with oil, wasabi, and vinegar dressing. And the final course was lamb kofta with date molasses. Now, the lamb had a weird sweet flavor. However, the company and the conversation with the exhibitor was delightful. When we got back to the hotel lobby, we were still talking. And who walks by? Sam Shamoonian again. And he grabs my shoulder and he says, "Great guy, Dr. Falk." And Kiara just laughs. She thought that was funny. Okay, so that brings us to the final day of the conference, which was Friday, November 22nd. And it began with the Crossway breakfast. This is an important event. This is where Crossway publishers give out free copies of their flagship book to theological influencers. The book they were featuring this year was Ruined Sinners to Reclaim, which was edited by David Gibson and Jonathan Gibson. Now, this book is massive, nearly 1,000 pages, which means that book is also really expensive. Okay? And many at the breakfast were wondering if they would have room or weight allowance in their luggage to bring this book home, because that's not a light book. I mean, I had to put it in my backpack because my luggage was getting too heavy. But at the breakfast, which consisted of fruit, danishes, scrambled eggs, bacon, and hash browns, I decided to sit at a table by myself because I'm an introvert. But Peter Williams joined me at the table. Now, he's the warden at Tyndale House and has written several important books on the New Testament. I've known Peter for years through my association with Tyndale House. And he told me that he had a copy of my book on his desk, but hadn't read it yet. He had inherited the library of Alan Millard, and my book was among them. Now, another interesting encounter occurred at that table. Wayne Grudem joined us. Now, if you don't know who Wayne Grudem is, he wrote a massive systematic theology text, sometimes colloquial, called the Big Book of Systematic Theology. I sat in a lecture by Grudem in 2019, and a lot has changed for him since then. I did notice that he was now suffering from advanced Parkinsonism, which was sort of sad to see. He was definitely not the same person he was in 2019, so do pray for the guy. But I introduced myself to him, and the first thing he said to me was, "Exodus, early or late date?" You can kind of see now how important this issue is when you say you're an Egyptologist and the first thing they ask you is early or late date. It's so ridiculous. I don't know why people might want to make this a primary issue, but they do. Okay, now I understand that there's a lot of baggage wrapped up in this controversy, but it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be. It shouldn't be used as a shibboleth test. But there you have it. Anyway, I replied to Grudem, late date. And then he replied, what do you do with 1446? Okay, so I said, the 480th year of 1 Kings 6:1 is an idiom denoting indeterminate time. This was observed years ago by Umberto Cassuto. And he said, I'll have to look into that. But then I added, I'm a student of James Hoffmeyer and Kenneth Kitchen. And Grudem gave me an interesting reply. They're great men of God. I said, yeah, yes they are. So that was the Crossway breakfast. It was a very interesting encounter with Wayne Grudem. But after the breakfast, I went to, again, another NES session. But something happened at the session before the paper got started. I arrived about 5-10 minutes early. Before the paper, I had a conversation with Stephen Rudd, who is an ABR and an NES insider. And the conversation was very friendly. We agreed that we should keep our disagreements a friendly in-house debate. And we even agreed that in a pluralism, put all our ideas out there and let the best ideas win. Apparently, somebody watched our conversation and was listening in and was astonished that we could have a friendly conversation. I don't know. I don't know what the surprise was here. Whether the surprise was that a late dater and an early dater could have a friendly conversation, or that I could be nice. But they were surprised. Surprise! So anyway, we finally came to the first paper of Friday morning, which was entitled Tel Es Satan, Jericho City 4, the city the Israelites conquered, by Brian Windle. Now, when the session began, this paper is really the first paper that's ever been done on Jericho City 5 at an NES conference. Because up to this point in time, the NES has denied the existence of Jericho City 5. That's the late Bronze City. Bryant Wood and Roger Young have for years denied the existence of Jericho City 5. Well, with the papers of Lorenzo Nigro, you can't do that anymore. Now, we also have to understand that Brian Windle is an ABR associate, so he believes in an early Exodus date. However, he also argued for the Septuagint reading of 1 Kings 6:1. So he tries to move the date of the Exodus 40 years later without it being the late date. And he argued in this paper that the late Bronze 1B 2A city was destroyed in the 1360s. And Windle is trying to interact with the excavations of Lorenzo Nigro. But he left out certain key details of Nigro's assessment. Ironically, Windle was asked if late Bronze 2B remains were found at Jericho. Now, these are the remains that date to, say, the late 13th century. So, roughly 1200. And Windle admitted that many, that was his word, many late Bronze 2B remains were found at the site. Windle also did not mention that Nigro did not find a late Bronze 1B 2A destruction, even though he found the city walls. And thus, Nigro thought that the city was destroyed in late Bronze 2B, after which the city transitioned into the Iron Age 1 fallow period. So, overall, my thoughts on the paper is that it was a desperate attempt to salvage the early date position in spite of all the most recent archaeological findings against the position. So he really is ignoring Lorenzo Nigro's conclusions and late Bronze 2B analysis to try to shove that destruction of Jericho back to the 1360s instead of to around circa 1220, as say Lorenzo Nigro would put it. Okay, so that covers that paper by Windle. Okay, so that covers Friday morning. Friday afternoon, I attended the Old Testament, Bible, and Ancient Near Eastern session, the O.T. Bain session. And the first paper I attended was a biblical reference of Pharaoh Merneptah's campaign, the four conditions of Exodus 23, 27, 30, by Terence J. Nichols. Now, Nichols made the claim in his paper that the wasp mentioned in Exodus 23, 27 to 30 was a reference to Merneptah's campaign into Canaan. He tried to compare the features of the wasp in the text to military actions. Now, one of the moderators commented that the reading was eisegesis and speculative. However, while the reading is speculative, it's also kind of incredulous to think that the local population of Levantines would have been driven out by stinging insects. So, the speculation has some merit. The next paper I attended was Beyond Type and Motif, a comparative analysis of Hezekiah's image usage in seals, by Gary Myers. Gary Myers claimed that the winged solar disk on the Hezekiah seal came not from Egyptian sources, but from Phoenician sources. He used generative AI to draw stylistic comparisons with other seals found in the Levant. Now, I think this paper was deeply problematic. Myers was trying to ask a research question that had already been considered a closed question. He didn't do his due diligence to show that the seal couldn't be Egyptian, especially given the Ankh signs that also appeared on the Hezekiah seal, and also considering that the wadjet is a symbol found all over Egypt. I think this paper really demonstrates the problem with not exposing, say, biblical studies people to the Egyptian material. People will only draw inferences from what they're inputted academically. So it's clear that this guy has never done any work in Egypt or up on Egyptian material, or even have a basic understanding of Egypt. So he took what was clearly an Egyptian symbol and tried to find a contextual framework for it within Canaan. And I think I don't think that works. I think that is just, it doesn't do his education a service to be that insular. So he didn't even know it was a closed question. So that just sort of shows you that if we don't expose our students enough, our Bible students enough, to Egypt, they're going to draw these faulty conclusions. The next paper was called Hard Comparisons: The Curses of the Bronze Sky and Iron Ground in EST and Deuteronomy 28:23. Now, EST is an abbreviation for the Esarhaddon Succession Treaty. Now, the paper was done by Mark Stephen Francois. Francois tried to show that the curse of Bronze Sky and Iron Ground found in both Deuteronomy 28:23 and their Esarhaddon succession treaty are closely related and come from a common source document. Now, modern scholarship claims that Deuteronomy 28:23 was borrowed directly from the Esarhaddon succession treaty. And conservative scholarship, on the other hand, denies any connection at all. While the denial of a connection between the two texts is incredulous, there are also differences in wording and syntax that indicate that the two texts share a common influence, but are not directly borrowing from each other. And I think here in this paper, Francois shows a well-balanced middle ground position here between the whole issue of borrowing and common influence. So I think he's definitely on the right track here. The final paper of the conference was called David the Moabite by Stephen Ortiz. And I have to admit, I'm a huge fan of Ortiz's work. I think his work excavating Gezer is fantastic. And he makes the argument that the lineage of David is a complex mix of clan identities that included Judahite, Ephraimite, and Moabite. Now, the paper he gave was originally a longer lecture that he was paring down on the fly for this presentation. Unfortunately, the paper didn't seem well organized because he was like cutting it as he was reading it. I also don't think some of the issues on clan affiliation were very well thought through. For example, he doesn't seem to understand that there's a difference between ethnonyms and toponyms for clans. You can be an ethnonym, and basically, like for example, we see this in 1 Samuel 1:1, where Samuel is both an Ephratati from the region of Ephraim and an Ephratati through lineage. So these ethnonyms and toponyms can be used for clans in either direction to denote regional designation or clan affiliation. And, when I asked him about this, he said, well, context tells you. Well, in some of those passages he quoted, the context is not clear. So I would have thought a more nuanced approach would have been better for his paper. I also think his paper could have benefited from a longer treatment, or at least could have been better organized instead of trying to edit it on the fly. I don't think that was, given how much nuance would have had to go into a paper like this, I don't think that treating this as expansively as he did the subject justice. So I would have loved to see his 3-hour lecture, because it's clearly taken from a 3-hour lecture. His 3-hour lecture probably would have been a lot better than trying to cram this into 30 minutes. So then, that was the final paper of the conference. After the paper, we changed hotels, had Kansas City barbecue for dinner, which was absolutely delicious. I mean, that's a great little barbecue place right across from the hotel. And then after that, we did our absolutely epic D&D game. And if you haven't seen that, see the card above. Okay, so we're going to end it here. We hope you enjoyed both parts of our recollections and our insider's look into the ETS conference and learned something. We have spilled all the tea, and we hope you enjoyed that. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.